Welcome to Emerging Technology Horizons. I'm Mark Lewis, the Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. And on today's episode, it is our absolute privilege to have Dr. Victoria Coleman join us. Dr. Coleman is the Chief Scientist of the United States Air Force. This position is one of many incredibly distinguished positions throughout her career. Previously, Dr. Coleman was the Director of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. She's had a long career that also includes time in industry, large companies, small companies, everything from startups to the biggest telecoms. And also, she has worked in academia. If I went through the full list of her experiences, it would use up our entire podcast time. But let me just say that I can't think of anyone more qualified at this point in time to serve as the Air Force Chief Scientist. So Victoria, first, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. So
you're welcome. Happy New Year.
Thank you.
And can I say, I can think of one person that would be even more suitable than me in this position. And
except I've already done it. But thank you. But so when I was Air Force Chief Scientist, I'll tell you, first of all, I thought it was one of the most impactful things that I ever was able to do in my career. But I also used to brag about the fact that the very fact that the Air Force has a chief scientist. The other services actually don't even have that. That makes you not only the highest ranking science technology professional in the Air Force, a 3-star equivalent, a general officer equivalent, it actually makes you the highest ranking science and technology professional in any of the services. And also, the position is quite unique that you are a pure scientist / engineer. You're not managing programs. You're separated from the day-to-day program management, so you really get to be the intellectual driver of the S&T portfolio for the service. So I thought if we could start, and let me just ask you about your role as the Air Force Chief Scientist. Obviously, I know a lot about it, but every Chief Scientist has approached the job very differently. So if you could tell us a little bit about your role and how you work with the Air Staff and the Air Force leadership.
So it's kind of interesting, Mark. I mean, as you know, this position actually predates the creation of the Air Force, which is kind of very unique. So the position was created while the service was still part of the Army. So, over those 70 plus years, obviously it has changed. And I think every chief scientist comes in and puts their own mark, partly to reflect, their kind of interests and backgrounds, but also to be responsive to what the service needs at any given time. So for me, coming in as the first chief scientist in the department that actually has 2 services versus 1, I think that is one of the kind of the driving kind of factors and the defining factors, I think, for my tenure in the position. Also, I mean, as you know, this is a position that rotates, and there's a very good reason for that. I mean, we always try to bring in a very fresh pair of eyes. So in addition, to not being encumbered with running specific programs, you also have a fresh pair of eyes that comes in from the outside with different experiences. And I think that's where the magic happens in this position. The mix of seniority, lack of encumbrance on programs, and the fresh pair of eyes, that's a very powerful kind of cocktail. It's a great mix. For me, as I said, the defining kind of moment is the fact that we now have to support 2 services. I still report to General Brown on the Air Force side, but I support both services. So I support both the CSO, the Chief of Service Operations, General Raymond, as well as General Brown, and of course the department leadership. Secretary Kendall and Undersecretary Jones. So in this environment, and given that our office is very small, I mean the challenge is to make sure that you pick the right things to work on, and those right things, as you know, some of them are kind of organic, right? I mean you can't ignore them if you wanted to. And some are things that you pick because you think there are priorities that the department ought to get after that nobody else is paying attention to. In some ways, it's easy to line up with priorities that everybody agrees on. But I think part of the job of the chief scientist is to say, hey, there are also these other things that are not prominent today for whatever reason that we ought to be paying attention to.
So that's a great lead into what are your priorities? What are the things that you're most focused on in this position?
So, it's... I mean, I wish there was a quick way to describe all that, but I will tell you the way that I'm approaching that is actually very fluid, right? So some chief scientists have come in and said, I'm going to do one thing, and I'm going to do that one thing really well. The approach that I'm taking is I want this position to be here, for the next 70 years. So I'm going to leave it, with a halo around its title, the seal when I leave. So what I'm trying to do is to figure out ways of making the office be helpful. In other words, as opposed to being just a bell ringer, can we actually, partner with the various, components, our colleagues on the air staff, on the space staff, to help them fix problems? One of the challenges that, I have, I'm sure you had it as well, is, stirring the pot, which is part of what we do, gets you only so far. After a little while, people get irritated, right? So, and if they get too irritated, then they just won't listen to you anymore. So you have to strike this balance of irritating them enough, but then helping them enough so that, growth can happen. So in order to do that, I plan our work on a quarterly basis. We have, a general kind of framework that defines what we do, but then every quarter we'll look at priorities and we adjust as the services need. So maybe it's helpful if I talk a little bit about this general framework. So the number one priority that we have is to give good science and technology advice to leadership. Pick kind of any program, ABMS, Hypersonics, Microelectronics, give them really good advice on specifics. But then another key thing that, again, I'm sure that, you experienced when you were in the seat is giving them good advice on the plurality of science and technology, including portfolio, the overall portfolio, budget, priorities, execution. How do we put it all together? How do we do technology transfer? So these are kind of the two cornerstones, but then there are two other significant pieces that I think partly are driven by the 2030 strategy that you and I had the privilege of working together on. And one of them is to support the science and technology community inside of the Department of the Air Force. I mean, I call it, I want a thriving S&T community. There isn't, other than this office, there isn't a place where, an individual, a senior individual is charged with making sure that, we nurture and take care of our science and technology talent all the way from, building a pipeline to bringing them in, to including them, to empowering them, to getting the benefit of their service. And then the last thing that I am really kind of focused on, and I think partly because of my background, but partly because of what we need right now, is open innovation. Building links with companies outside of the department, both traditional and non-traditional, university departments, institutes, to make sure that we are connected with goodness and innovation no matter what it happens, right? And we can bring that benefit back to the service.
By the way, I'm smiling broadly because that's exactly the answer I would have given. Right. So, there's some of the chief scientists, sometimes we past chief scientists have discussed whether the chief scientist should be essentially the advocate for the S&T enterprise, the service. And I always said yes. And some have taken a somewhat removed view, but I love the fact that you've got that same viewpoint, that someone has to be the champion for science technology. I always thought it was important. It says a lot about the Air Force that there is someone at such a high level who's sitting at the right hand of the chief of staff and is in all the important meetings and is representing science and technology and the broader community. So I'm delighted, obviously, that you've got that viewpoint. So as I mentioned in the introduction, you've come with such a rich background. Background in academia, background in industry, your time at DARPA. Tell me a little bit. How do those experiences kind of influence the approach that you've taken to being the chief scientist?
Yeah. Well, so. First of all, when you know this, when you work in the private sector, time waits for no one.
Right.
There's an urgency in the private sector that I've lived my entire career around, and I think I bring that sense of urgency in this position. Every day I wake up, I'm thinking, what did we achieve? What could we do today to have immediate outcomes? So I think that sense of urgency, comes with having worked in the industry and having to meet deadlines and having to deliver product and all these things, right? Because if you don't do them right, your business goes away. So I think, I come from a world where feedback on your work is almost immediate. And if it's not immediate, it's very timely. Sometimes in the department it takes
Yeah,
years
or
for the impact
decades.
of decisions to
Yeah,
be felt,
yeah.
or decades in areas that you and I perhaps will give an opportunity to speak about more today, like hypersonics. You make a decision 10 years ago, there was a bad decision, but maybe it takes 10 years for you to realize that. Well, in the private world, it's not like that. It's much more immediate. So I think that's one thing. I think I bring this sense of urgency, but then I think the way that we work. So, we do, like I said, quarterly plans. So if you walk into any company here in the Valley, they work quarterly. So we have, four outcomes that we're after every year, which are the four things I talked to you about, like open innovation. But also we understand that in order to get there, in order to have that impact, we need to do specific things. So every quarter we have a set of objectives that we associate with each one of these outcomes. So, for example, in the case of the actionable advice on S&T, this coming quarter, Q1 or Q2 in government quarters, is we have 7 initiatives that we're looking at. One of them is looking at ABMS. Some of them, another one is looking at directed energy in the portfolio there. Looking at ways of taking artificial intelligence and enabling the U.S. Space Force mission. Looking at microelectronics, building out a strategy for the department. Advancing tactical autonomy, a whole bunch of stuff that we plan and track on a weekly basis. We don't quite do it as stand-up, but it's a stand-up. So in industry, this is what I did every day. Every Monday we had a stand-up where we looked at the work of the week ahead. What did we do? What did we miss? So, we are managing our work in the office very much the same way as you would manage it in a company outside. So I think that's the second piece. The third piece that I think is also important is I come from a world of, technology transition being kind of the bread and butter of what I was doing. So I have a good sense for all the ways that you can get this right and all the ways that you can get this wrong. And as you know, in the department, this is really hurting us. It's not that we lack for innovation. We lack for the ability to translate that innovation into operational capability. So having spent my entire career, getting after this in the world outside, I have a good sense for things that work, things that don't work. And I hope to bring some of that expertise, inside of the Air Force and, kind of empower my colleagues as well who haven't had that experience to be able to make the same the same kind of thought process and decision making that I would
Excellent.
apply.
And of course, I had the privilege of serving alongside of you when you were running DARPA, and I have to say, I think in terms of the impact that you had in your time at DARPA, it was absolutely remarkable. And I'm seeing some of the same things that you did at DARPA. I see you applying to the chief scientist's office. So if I could focus on technical areas. So you are an international leader in the cyber areas in computer science and in microelectronics. And I'm wondering, could you tell us, broadly, where do you see the Air Force and the department going in those areas?
So, I think on the cyber side, it's undoubtedly the case that, as the department overall, we have ways to go. Right? If you think of cyber as a contested domain, I think it would be hard pressed to say that we're making full use of that domain.
Right.
So I think that we have a ton of work to do, and we have a ton of work to do. Not only within this fairly narrow kind of cyber domain, but also seeing how, if you infuse that domain with the others. We call this joint all domain, command and control. What can you achieve then? So, one of the things that I really want to see us putting more emphasis on is understanding how we can use cyber to supplement and support other, other defensive and offensive means that we are developing in the department. I don't think that we are nearly as far ahead as we need to be. You mentioned my tenure at DARPA. While I was there, I had the privilege of seeing so many wonderful ideas, kind of hybrid ideas that blend the cyber with the physical, and that's where magic really happens. Yeah. So I'm very hopeful that, as programs from DARPA mature and as our own kind of posture and, ability to meld these domains matures, that will have um, much more impact to the mission. I wanted to say a
Yeah.
few things about
Yeah.
microelectronics. You and I worked on this together when we were both in the OSD, and before that. It's an area that remains a challenge for us. We are here almost 2 years after the passage of the CHIPS Act. Um, I think we are well postured in the department to begin, kind of building our part of the equation, if you like. I think overall, because we still don't know what the appropriations would look like and so on, as the federal government, we don't have a crisp enough plan to get after that. So all the reasons why chips were so important, were true 2 years ago. They're even more true now because, our competition has not stood still in that time. So I think it's just paramount that we get clarity around, budgets and appropriations so that, we can collectively begin to execute. The piece that has to be executed at Commerce, the piece that needs to be executed in the OSD, as well as the piece that needs to be executed inside of the Department of the Air Force. I spend a lot of time talking to my colleagues in the OSD. In R&E, we'll have a principal director, Dr. Shinoy, who's working this. What I think we need to do to support kind of the overall kind of direction is to be very clear and crisp about our own requirements when it comes to microelectronics inside the Air Force. And this is not something that we have done to date in a coherent, cohesive fashion. In other words, taking stock of what we need now, what we need to go do lifetime buys, as well as what we will need 5-10 years out, so that we can plan out technology development. We can go to our colleagues in OST and say, please build out a roadmap that comprehends our needs and so on. So this coming quarter, I want us in the Air Force to be really good citizens and, get our house in order, understand what it is that we need, and take those requirements and use them to infuse the process that R&E is running. So we will be working closely with AFRL and also AAQR to pull together the Air Force microelectronics strategy. We hope to be able to deliver it by the end of March. And then I'd love to come back and talk to you about that once we have it.
We'd love to have you here. And of course, AAQR is the part of the Air Force Acquisition Office that oversees funding for the lab. So again, I used to describe the Air Force S&T portfolio as a three-legged stool: AQR, the money, AFRL, execution, and then the chief scientist, who outranks them both, by the way. But also kind of providing the overall guidance. So that's wonderful. And I also note, before you took over leadership at DARPA through your role in the Defense Science Board, you helped us in R&E craft the department-wide roadmap, and that was working with our mutual friend Nicole Petta, who still one of my heroes. Our principal director for Microelectronics did a phenomenal job.
Same here. And Mark, let me say a few words about that, if I may.
Yeah.
I think the work that you did and that Nicole Petta did while you were both in the OST was nothing short of heroic. I have never seen, that organization be able to execute with such precision, clarity, speed, focus, ever. In an area like microelectronics, which is so broad, right? It's not like microelectronics is something that the DoD controls. And if we say we want this, we're going to get off and do it. In order to get outcomes in that space, you guys had to create a community, both inside and outside the department, in commercial industry, to get people aligned. You have made incredible strides, and minus that, I don't think chips would even have been, a glimmer in the eye, let alone have an opportunity to succeed. If chips succeeds, it will be so because of the foundation that you and Nicole have laid while you were both in the OSD.
So on this rare,
thank you.
But on this rare occasion, I'm going to disagree with you about something, and that is, it wasn't me; it was all Nicole. So she gets.
I actually remember who empowered Nicole. So, we're going to agree to disagree on that one, Mark.
Okay. All right. Well, that sounds fair. But I think also, I mean, you help formulate that the whole notion of zero trust in microelectronics, which was kind of fundamental to everything that we're trying to do. And again, through the Defense Science Board, but also through the roadmap exercise. Um, so it's great to see you in the position now in the service to help implement that. And dare I say, the Air Force is now taking a leadership role in this area, in large measure, a tribute to your position right now on the air staff. Um, so
Thank you. We couldn't help ourselves, and I
yeah,
mean, as you know, without microelectronics of the right variety, we cannot succeed.
yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, it's one of these infrastructures that without which, and unfortunately, it's not an infrastructure that you can build overnight.
Yeah,
It's something that you really, we talked about 5-10 year timelines.
yeah,
We're
no,
definitely in that space when it comes to microelectronics.
absolutely. And again, when you and I were in R&D, I mean, we advertised microelectronics as our number one modernization priority. Which, as a hypersonics guy, I always tell the story. I came back to the department and I, ready to go on hypersonics. It's our number one priority. And on day one, Mike Griffin said, "Yeah, it's not really a number one priority. Microelectronics are number one priority." And I quickly saw why. And as you say, it was just fundamental to every single thing that we do. So,
but it's interesting because when I reflect back, Mark, at our time together, I perhaps helped make you a microelectronics person, and you helped make me a hypersonics person. Because I gotta tell you, when I walked through the door at DARPA, I knew very little about hypersonics. But through our partnership, well, first of all, I understood how important it was once I was in the building. Second of all, through our partnership, I think I became kind of educated and perhaps even more passionate than you are on that topic.
So that's a perfect lead-in because I can't let I can't let this conversation go without talking about hypersonics. So obviously hypersonics is a big DoD priority, and there are recent developments, especially from China, on hypersonics that have gotten even more attention, although we were already paying attention to what China was doing. What can you tell us about the Air Force's activities in the hypersonic arena, and where do you see the future going?
So, great question. Again, until I joined the department, I didn't used to worry about hypersonics. Now, when I wake up in the morning, I worry about it even more than I worry about microelectronics, to tell you the truth. You mentioned China, and we all know, their ability to execute field, using means that necessarily we wouldn't use to advance their agenda. But did you notice that North Korea is now doing hypersonic testing?
Yes, although
so
I'm
it's
a little
not just a
skeptical.
peer competitor.
Yeah, with North Korea, you always have to wonder what's real and what's, but yeah.
You do, but the point is that we have allowed ourselves to fall so far behind that even so non-peer adversaries may also be getting ahead of us. So when I reflect on how we got here, and I think you'll agree with me on this, partly it's because the department had not had the singular focus and vision that is needed to deliver on a capability like this. We talked about long timelines. It takes a long time to be able to build both the technology, the infrastructure, but also the industrial base that you need in order to build these technologies and fill them. So, we've taken our eye off the ball more than once, and I think now we're reaping the benefit, of that lack of focus. So what do we do now? I think the Air Force recognizes that, hypersonics is a key ingredient, a key arrow, in our quiver. There are missions that we know we cannot pursue without hypersonics. Our focus now is to accelerate both development but also fielding, and prioritize in areas where we think that we can, we can actually field capability before others do. There has been inside the department, I think, again, a singular focus and a rude wake-up call, given the kind of the recent successes that China had in that environment. The question is, how do you succeed, and what is it that we could be doing differently. And I'll tell you, I see three areas. One is making sure that, again, we have the right industrial base. We have to be very consistent in our view about the priority both of developing the technology, but then also procuring it and developing it. We have to be very clear and we have to stick to that. The other thing that we need to do, honestly, is a ton more testing. I find it really shocking to see how few tests we're able to pull off. And in any new technology, certainly a technology that is as complex and has as many unknowns as hypersonics, the only way to get ahead is to test often, to test frequently, to test every week if you can. There are these famous words that Elon Musk shared with our CSO General Raymond about the success of his launch business. And this. So he's able to launch basically every week. So every time he has what he calls a rendezvous with reality, he learns a ton of stuff that then very quickly he pulls back into the next release. And the next release is not 6 months from now, it's next week. So you need that pace, that speed of testing and learning and, fielding, if you like, to be able to make progress. Today, we're in a position where we just don't have the testing, resources that we need in order to be able to get after this frequently enough. I know that, actually, you introduced me to a company, a fabulous company out here in California called Stratolaunch that are experimenting with ways of supporting hypersonic testing. I'm sure there are many other companies that are doing the same thing, and that's where this open innovation kind of strategy that I spoke about earlier, I think comes into it. We need to move away from considering just say the testing capacity that we have at Edwards or in a few other places. We need to be much broader and see how can we work with the world outside to accelerate our ability to test. And then the last thing I would say is that I'm surprised in the world, of digital twins and, digital engineering, how little of that we actually do ahead of our tests. I just think that we need to be much more, thoughtful and almost promiscuous, if you like, in our use of digital testing and digital, twinning simulations to allow us to make progress much faster than we would be able to do otherwise. I got to tell you, as somebody, I've worked in bits versus atoms all my career. And, when it comes to hypersonics, it's all about atoms, right? So it's not nearly as clean a world as computer science is, but there's a ton that we could be doing a lot more to supplement, kind of the physical with the kind of the digital domain in order to make progress.
Yeah, I could not agree more with all of your comments. Which fills me with a lot of hope, by the way. It means the person who is setting the S&T agenda for the Air Force gets it. So thank you. But yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on, and especially like your shout out to the folks who are trying to build test infrastructure. You mentioned Stratolaunch. There are folks who are talking about building new wind tunnel complexes. The state of Indiana is stepping up. To build a new hypersonic propulsion complex. Some small companies that are stepping into the hypersonic test realm. I worry it's maybe too little too late, but then better late than never. But also I love your comment about testing early and testing often. Just recently, I saw an op-ed in a defense publication claiming that one of the problems is we're moving too quickly. And I read this and I wanted to scream at the publication like, no, it's the opposite. We're moving too slowly. We need to be moving more quickly. So let's see. Speaking of moving quickly, this time has moved very, very quickly. And I wish we could keep talking. I think we could talk for hours and hours, but the powers that be will not permit that. So Victoria, let me once again thank you so much for your time. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I heard an implicit promise to come back on the podcast, so I'm going to hold you to that promise. And thank you so much for joining us.